I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of a heart monitor, and the first face I saw wasn't worried about me at all. It belonged to my husband's attorney, whose signature was already printed at the bottom of a stack of papers. Grant didn't ask if I was in pain. He asked if I had a working hand to hold a pen. 3 weeks later, he married someone else. He thought he'd taken everything from me. He had no idea what he was actually walking away from. My name is Sloan Calloway. I'm 33 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Coast Guard, and for 11 years, I've flown search and rescue helicopters out of stations up and down the Pacific coast. That job teaches you a very specific kind of stillness, the kind where your hands stay steady on the controls even when the ocean below you is trying to kill someone, even when your own fear is screaming louder than the rotor wash in your headset. I needed every ounce of that stillness on a gray October morning in a recovery room at Harborview, 4 hours after surgeons finished stabilizing two fractured vertebrae from a hard landing during a night rescue off Cape Flattery. The anesthesia hadn't fully cleared. My mouth was sandpaper. Every breath pulled at something deep in my back, and the fluorescent lights felt too sharp, too loud, in a way light shouldn't be able to feel. I remember blinking slowly, trying to bring the room into focus, thinking, he'll be here. Grant and I had been married 7 years. Whatever had gone quiet between us over the last two, I still believed that when it actually mattered, when I was lying broken in a hospital bed, my husband would walk through that door with his hand looking for mine. He walked in with a folder instead. Not flowers, not coffee. A plain manila folder tucked under his arm like he was closing on a house. He didn't sit down. He didn't touch me. He stood at the foot of the bed, and in the same, even, professional voice he used with his wealthiest clients, he said, "I filed for divorce, Sloan." I stared at him. My throat was still raw from the breathing tube, and I couldn't have argued even if I'd wanted to. But it wasn't only my throat that had gone silent. Something deeper in me had been quietly closing itself off for longer than I wanted to admit. He set the folder on the rolling tray beside my bed, right next to a plastic cup of water I hadn't been able to drink yet, and opened it himself, flipping through the pages like he was presenting a portfolio review. He told me, in that same flat advisory voice, that he'd be keeping the house in Port Townsend, the truck, the furniture we'd picked out together the year we got married. He said it like he was reading a checklist, like none of it had ever meant anything beyond its resale value. "You just need to sign," he said. "That's all this is." I looked down at my hands, an IV taped into the back of one, a hospital bracelet loose around my wrist, and I thought about every night I'd sat up with him while a client's portfolio cratered, every leave I'd burned flying home just to make his mother's birthday dinner. None of it seemed to exist in the room with us anymore. It had all been quietly erased and replaced with a folder and a pen. Then he said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about how little he had ever actually seen me. "You make Coast Guard pay, Sloan. You know that's not going to carry you through a divorce like this." He said it almost gently, like he felt sorry for me. "You'll never come out ahead financially. Not from this." I didn't correct him. I didn't mention the maritime engineering firm my uncle had left me a controlling stake in, or the Harbor Land Trust that had sat quietly in my name for 4 years, or the wealth manager who'd been growing all of it in the background of a life that otherwise looked exactly like every other Coast Guard family's life. A modest 3-bedroom rental, a used truck, coupons clipped out of habit more than necessity. Something in me, call it exhaustion, call it the specific clarity that comes right after surgery when the drugs strip away everything except the truth, decided I didn't owe him an explanation. So I picked up the pen with my good hand, and I signed. I signed the house away. I signed the truck away. I signed away 7 years without saying a single word about what he didn't know he was leaving on the table. He took the folder back, actually thanked me like I'd done him a favor, and walked out without looking back. 3 weeks later, while I was still doing laps around the ward with a physical therapist gripping my arm, Grant Ashford married a woman named Bianca Foss at a small ceremony on Whidbey Island. Someone sent me a photo I never asked for. He was smiling the wide, easy smile I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. I looked at it for a long time, then set my phone face down on the hospital tray and closed my eyes because, underneath the ache in my back, there was something else. something Grant didn't know was already coming for him. To understand why he never saw any of this coming, you'd have to understand the quiet architecture underneath our marriage, the part nobody else was invited to see. I met Grant at a mutual friend's cookout in Bremerton, back when I was a junior officer, and he was 2 years into building his own book of clients at a boutique wealth management firm. He had an easy, practiced charm, the kind that made strangers trust him within minutes. I liked that about him. I didn't yet understand that the same charm he used to build client relationships was the thing he'd eventually use to avoid ever really looking at me. From the beginning, I kept my finances quiet, and that wasn't about hiding anything specifically from him. It was how I was raised. My father managed a small marina and believed money should be discussed rarely, if at all. When my uncle Desmond passed away 4 years into our marriage, he left me something nobody expected: a 60% controlling stake in North Star Marine Engineering, the salvage and harbor construction firm he'd built from a single tugboat into a respected regional company over 4 decades. Alongside the company stake came something else, something Desmond had drafted decades earlier when the working waterfront in Port Townsend was still full of fishing families instead of condominium developers. A land trust holding roughly 11 acres of harbor adjacent industrial parcels, with a clause Desmond had insisted on when he first drew up the paperwork with a young attorney fresh out of law school. Any future redevelopment of the neighboring commercial waterfront required the trust's formal right of first refusal before the county would approve rezoning. He'd written it to protect the working harbor from exactly the kind of glossy luxury development that was already creeping up the coast. I didn't fully understand its weight when I inherited it. I just knew Desmond had trusted me with it, and I wasn't going to be careless with what he'd built. I found a wealth manager named Odette Marchetti through an old squadron mate, set up proper trust administration, and let it all grow quietly in the background of a life that gave nothing away. No new jewelry, no new car. Partly that was Coast Guard culture. You don't flash anything around people living paycheck to paycheck on an enlisted salary. But partly, if I'm honest with myself now, it was a test I never admitted I was running. I wanted to know whether Grant loved the woman standing in front of him or the version of stability he assumed I represented. He failed that test slowly, in small ways, long before any divorce papers reached my hospital bed. I remember trying to explain, maybe our second year of marriage, that my finances weren't only the number on my Coast Guard pay stub, that there were other things, accounts and holdings that mattered even if the paperwork kept them legally separate. He cut me off before I finished the sentence. "I manage people's money for a living, Sloan," he said, waving his fork like he was swatting a fly. "I think I understand net worth a little better than you do." I sat there with my mouth still open around a sentence he never let me finish, and something in me quietly closed. Not dramatically, just a door settling shut, click by click, until one day you realize it locked years ago and you don't remember exactly when. He started pulling away around year 5. The phone angled slightly out of view during dinner, the client meetings running later into the evening. I've spent over a decade reading stressed, frightened people in the worst moments of their lives for a living. I knew, in that quiet way, you know something before you're ready to say it out loud, that he was seeing someone else. I found out her name eventually: Bianca Foss, an event planner he'd handled a trust account for the year before. By the time I had real confirmation, I was 6 weeks out from a training deployment that would end with me on an operating table, and I was too depleted to fight for something that had already quietly ended on his side. So I let it happen, and I focused on healing my body, because that was a fight I still had some control over. When my attorney, an old family friend named Marisol Ibarra, reviewed the settlement Grant's lawyer had drawn up, she read it twice, then looked at me over her glasses with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet amusement. "He listed the house and the truck as marital assets," she said, tapping the page, "and asked for nothing else. Sloan, does he know what's actually in your name?" I shook my head. "He's never asked." Marisol folded her hands and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with knowing exactly how this story was going to unfold. "Well," she said, "he's about to find out something interesting." The weeks after the divorce were, by every outward measure, A triumph for Grant Ashford. He posted the wedding photos within 48 hours. Bianca in white on a bluff overlooking the sound, Grant in linen with his tie loosened just enough to look effortless, captions written for an audience. A mutual friend from our old church group forwarded me one with a note that said, "Only thought you should know before you heard it somewhere else." I looked at it once, felt a strange, distant ache that had more to do with nostalgia than heartbreak, and set the phone down. What none of them knew, standing in our old kitchen while Grant bragged to his friends about keeping the house like he'd won a negotiation, was that the house had never been the asset that mattered. He'd kept the shell, a mortgage underwater since the last market correction, a truck with a check engine light he'd been putting off, furniture I'd refinished myself on weekends between deployments. What he hadn't asked for because he didn't know it existed was the actual architecture of what I owned. 60% of North Star Marine Engineering, which had quietly tripled in value as the company won two federal harbor maintenance contracts nobody outside a small circle of investors had heard about yet, and the Callaway Harbor Trust, sitting on 11 acres that were about to become the single most contested piece of real estate on that stretch of coastline. None of it was hidden through deception. It was simply never volunteered, because he had never once created the space where volunteering it felt safe. And under the law, since every bit of it predated our marriage or came to me through inheritance, none of it was subject to division. Marisol made sure the settlement reflected that with surgical precision. The house, the truck, the joint checking account, nothing more. She asked me once, over coffee after the paperwork was finalized, whether I wanted the settlement language to spell out my full net worth so he'd understand exactly what he'd missed. Some people want their ex to know exactly what they lost, she said carefully. I thought about it, stirring my coffee slowly. No, I said finally. Let him find out on his own. Let it come from the world, not from me. I didn't want my worth to be a weapon I brandished on my way out the door. I wanted him to meet the truth naturally, the way he should have met it years earlier, if he'd ever cared enough to look. I didn't think about Grant much in the first weeks after that. I assumed our paths would simply drift apart the way most divorced couples do. I didn't know yet how quickly all of it would come apart around him instead. It started, as these things often do, with paperwork nobody thought to double check. Grant had spent the better part of that year chasing the biggest deal of his career outside his advisory work, a waterfront redevelopment on the old North Star maintenance yard and the parcels beside it, a mixed-use project of condominiums, and a marina club that would have made him and his investment partner, a developer named Owen Castellano, several $1 million apiece. Owen had been running standard due diligence on the site title before finalizing a seven-figure commitment, the kind of routine records search nobody expects to turn up anything interesting. It turned up the Callaway Harbor Trust. Buried in a decades-old covenant attached to the parcel deeds was Desmond's right of first refusal clause, still fully active, still legally binding, requiring the trust's written consent before any rezoning or redevelopment could proceed on the adjacent commercial waterfront. Owen's title attorney flagged it within a day. The trust's listed administrator was Sloane Callaway, Grant's ex-wife. Owen called Grant that same afternoon, and from what I pieced together later from people who were in the room, he didn't accuse Grant of anything outright. He simply said, in the careful language of men who've decided not to burn a bridge but also don't intend to walk across it again, that he needed to understand why Grant had never mentioned that his own ex-wife held veto power over the exact parcel their deal depended on, especially since Grant had personally guaranteed the timeline to their other investors. Owen pulled out within the week. That was the first domino, but it wasn't the last. The refinance Grant needed to cover the house now that it was solely his fell apart when the bank's underwriter, running a routine records check tied to the same title search, found the trust connection and flagged an undisclosed conflict of interest on Grant's original loan application, which had listed projected income from the redevelopment deal as part of his qualifying assets. His compliance department at the advisory firm opened an internal review 2 weeks after that. Once a client whose portfolio included a minority position in North Star's parent holding company asked, almost casually, whether Grant's advisory relationship with them presented any conflict given his prior marriage to the majority shareholder. None of it involved me making a single phone call. I didn't have to. The truth simply existed, quietly, in the public record, waiting for anyone who cared enough to look. Grant told me the rest himself months later, in a conversation neither of us expected to have. He said he was standing in his kitchen when the compliance letter arrived, Bianca sifting through the mail beside him out of the same anxious habit she'd carried since childhood, when money had always been tight. She saw the firm's letterhead and asked what it was. He read it twice without understanding a single sentence beyond the words, material undisclosed conflict of interest regarding former spouse's controlling equity position. Then his phone rang. The bank. Then Owen's attorney, confirming in writing that the redevelopment partnership was formally dissolved. Then, 3 days later, a certified letter from his own firm's compliance office placing him on unpaid leave, pending a full review of his client disclosures. Bianca's version of the marriage had been built on a very specific story that Grant was on the verge of the kind of wealth that would let her stop worrying about the things she'd grown up worrying about. When that story started collapsing, she didn't handle it quietly. Mutual acquaintances told me she began asking questions in front of other people, at dinners, at the gym, in a way that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. Did you know he lost the North Star deal because of his ex-wife? She reportedly asked one of Grant's old friends at a birthday party, loud enough that 3 other people heard it. Within a week, so had I. I want to be honest about something. I felt no triumph watching it happen. There's a particular kind of sadness in watching a life you were once part of come apart from a distance, even when the person at the center caused his own collapse. I remembered the version of Grant I'd met at that cookout in Bremerton, before ambition curdled into entitlement, before he decided my worth could be measured entirely by a number on a pay stub. Some nights, hearing another piece of it secondhand, I felt something closer to grief than satisfaction. But I didn't call him. I let him sit inside the consequences of a life built on assumptions, because that was the only education left that might actually reach him. While all of that unfolded around him, my own life moved forward in a much quieter rhythm. I finished physical therapy a full month ahead of schedule, mostly through sheer stubbornness. I returned to modified flight status, then full status, easing back into the work that had shaped my adult identity. I sat in on a board meeting for North Star as majority shareholder for the first time, listening to engineers half my age talk about harbor systems Desmond had helped design decades earlier, feeling something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with Grant at all. A quiet certainty that my life had never needed his belief in it to be real. Then, on an evening in early spring, almost 5 months after the divorce papers first landed in my hospital room, my phone lit up with a voicemail. Grant's name sat above it, 4 minutes and 18 seconds long. I stared at it for a while before I finally pressed play. His voice didn't sound like the man who'd stood at the foot of my hospital bed with a folder under his arm. It sounded smaller, tired in a way I'd never heard from him, even in our worst years together. "Sloan," he started, and there was a long pause, long enough that I almost thought the message had cut off. I don't even know what to say that doesn't sound like an excuse. I know I don't deserve you calling back. I just need you to know. I know now. I know what I threw away, and I'm not talking about the house. He kept going, admitting things in fragments he'd clearly been ashamed to say to anyone. That the firm had let him go entirely once the review concluded. That Bianca had moved out 2 weeks earlier. That he'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in his life. Not because he wanted to, but because he genuinely didn't understand how he'd become a person who could stand in a hospital room and hand his wife divorce papers instead of asking if she was in pain. I listened to the whole message twice before I decided anything. Then I called Marisol, not for legal advice this time, just to talk it through with someone who'd watched the whole story unfold from the beginning. She listened, then asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to see him?" I sat with that question for 3 days. Not because I was afraid of him anymore. There was nothing left in me that feared Grant Ashford. I took the time because I wanted to be sure that if I agreed to meet him, it would be for the right reason. Not to gloat. Not to let him see what he'd lost laid out in front of him like a trophy. We met on a Thursday afternoon at a small coffee shop on Water Street. the kind of place that had no history for either of us. He'd lost weight, not in the deliberate way he used to talk about at dinner parties, but in the tired, sleepless way stress eats away at a person. He stood when he saw me, and for a second, neither of us said anything. "Thank you for coming," he finally said, his voice rougher than I remembered. I let him talk first because I could see he needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. He cried somewhere in the middle of it, quietly, almost involuntarily, like it surprised even him. He said he understood now how badly he'd failed to see me, that he'd let a number on a pay stub become the entire measure of my worth because it was easier than actually asking who I was underneath the uniform. He said Bianca had used him nearly as much as he'd used his own assumptions about me, that once the payoff she'd expected never materialized, she'd made it very clear what she'd actually married him for. When he finally finished, when the silence had stretched long enough that the barista had refilled our neighbor's coffee twice, I spoke, keeping my voice even, without a trace of triumph in it. "I didn't lose a marriage because I made less money, Grant," I said. "I lost one because you never cared enough to actually know me." He flinched at that, harder than he had at anything the bank or his compliance department or Owen Castellano had told him in the months before. I think some part of him had hoped this conversation would end with some kind of reconciliation, some acknowledgement of what he'd lost in dollar terms. I made sure that was never on the table. I hadn't come to talk about money. I'd never once needed him to know exactly what I was worth in numbers. I reached into my bag and set a plain envelope on the table between us, copies of the original settlement, along with a short handwritten note I'd drafted the night before, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. I wasn't giving him closure out of forgiveness exactly. I was giving it to myself, closing a door I'd been holding half open since the moment he walked in with that folder under his arm. "I hope you figure out who you actually want to be, Art," I told him, standing before either of us could turn the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. I walked out into the ordinary brightness of a Thursday afternoon and didn't look back over my shoulder the way people do in movies. I already knew he was watching. It didn't matter anymore. Nearly a year passed before our paths crossed again. By the time the invitation arrived, heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, an evening reception hosted by the Regional Maritime Heritage Council, I almost didn't recognize the name it was addressed to. Lieutenant Commander Sloan Calloway, recipient of a community stewardship commendation for the Callaway Harbor Trust's donation of 4 waterfront acres to a public fishing access easement, permanently protecting it from development. I almost didn't go. Ceremonies had never been my language, but I wore a simple navy dress, my late mother's small gold earrings, and stood in a banquet hall in Port Townsend, surrounded by harbor pilots, county commissioners, and colleagues who'd only ever known the quiet, steady version of me. My commanding officer said a few words about the rescues I'd flown. My old flight crew sat near the front, cheering louder than the room's dignity probably called for, and I laughed for what felt like the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Near the end of the evening, as servers cleared the dessert plates, I saw him. Grant was standing near the edge of the room, not as a guest. I learned later he'd taken a job managing logistics for the catering company that had won the event contract. He looked different. Thinner, but steadier, like a man who'd stopped running from something and finally turned to face it. When our eyes met across the room, there was no performance in his expression at all. No charm, no advisory smile, just something quiet, a little sad, and underneath it, something that looked almost like peace. He crossed the room slowly, hands in his pockets. "You look happy," he said when he reached me. It wasn't a line, it was just true, offered plainly. "I am," I said, and meant it completely. He glanced at the commendation pinned near my collar and opened his mouth like he wanted to say more. Another apology, maybe. Some explanation for the black catering uniform instead of the life he'd once been so certain he was building. But I didn't need to hear it, and something in his face told me he understood that too. "Take care of yourself, Grant," I said, and meant that completely as well. Not as a dismissal, but as something closer to genuine hope for a man I'd once loved, even if that love hadn't survived what he chose to believe about me. I turned and walked back toward my table, toward the people who had actually shown up for me across 11 years of deployments and recoveries and quiet, unglamorous work, and I didn't look back to see whether he was still watching. I already knew the answer, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't hold any weight over me at all. Driving home that night with the windows cracked to let in the cool spring air, I thought about everything that had happened since that morning in the hospital room: the folder, the signature, the quiet unraveling that followed, the coffee shop conversation that closed the last real door between us. And I understood the truest thing I'd learned through all of it wasn't about money, or vindication, or even forgiveness. Grant had spent 7 years believing my worth began and ended with a number on a pay stub. But the biggest thing he ever lost was never the house, or the truck, or the life he assumed he'd won by walking away first. It was the woman who had loved him quietly, patiently, and completely, long before he ever thought to ask what she was really worth.